My girlfriend left me for a guy she met online saying, "He understands me better than you ever could." I let her go without resistance. Months later, she texted me after his engagement announcement with someone else went viral. "He understands me in ways you never could." That was it. That was the whole thing. 6 years, and that sentence was all I got. No screaming match. No thrown dishes. No dramatic confrontation in a parking lot. Just her voice. Completely calm. Like she was reciting something she had written weeks ago and memorized in the mirror. Maybe she had. I remember looking at her face right after she said it. I was searching for something. Regret, maybe. Or at least a flicker of hesitation. But she just looked at me with this quiet, level expression. Not angry. Not sad. Not even uncomfortable. Just done. She had already left before she said the words. The words were just paperwork. And me? I said nothing. I stood there in our living room. In the apartment we'd picked out together. Surrounded by the furniture we'd argued about at IKEA on a Sunday afternoon 3 years ago. Both of us exhausted and laughing and somehow making every single decision wrong the first time. I stood in the middle of all that history. And I said absolutely nothing. I didn't beg. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even ask his name. Not yet. And when she reached down and picked up the bag she'd already packed. Because yes, it was already packed. Already sitting right there near the front door, which I had somehow walked past without registering. I just watched her. She walked to the door. She opened it. She looked back at me once. Just once. And then she closed it behind her. Quietly. No slam. No drama. Just a soft, final click. I stood there for a moment. Then I sat down on the couch. Our couch. And I stared at the wall. I told myself I was being mature. I told myself I was respecting her choice. I told myself that fighting for someone who doesn't want to stay is not love. It's just desperation wearing love's clothing. But underneath all that reasonable logic, I was completely shattered. And here is the thing I didn't know yet. Here is the thing I couldn't have predicted, sitting on that couch staring at that wall. The story was not over. It hadn't even gotten to the part where everything I believed I understood about what had happened turned out to be entirely wrong. You need to understand what I was actually losing. Not just a girlfriend. Not just 6 years. We had plans. Real ones. The kind you write down and then tape to the refrigerator like their contract terms. We had looked at houses in the spring. Actual houses. We'd driven around on weekends with coffee cups and a short list of addresses and opinions about crown molding. We had a trip booked for the following month. We had talked about names. Not seriously. But we'd had that conversation at least once. Late at night, half joking. Lying on the floor of the living room for some reason I can't even remember. And she had said she liked the name August for a boy. I had laughed. I told her it sounded like a month, not a name. She'd laughed too. That was us. We laughed. A lot. Or we used to. Because somewhere in the last 8, 9 months, the laughter had gotten quieter. I noticed it. Of course I noticed it. But I did what a lot of people do when they notice something uncomfortable. I talked myself out of seeing it clearly. I told myself every couple goes through phases. I told myself we were both busy, both stretched thin. She had changed jobs in the spring, and the transition had been rough. I was putting in long hours at work, genuinely long, not as an excuse. These things happen, I told myself. You push through. That's what I believed. What I didn't realize, what I genuinely could not see coming, was that while I was pushing through, she was pulling away, and someone else was already there to catch her. I didn't realize it then. But that night, sitting alone on that couch, everything was already in motion. Something irreversible had already begun. And the worst part? I was the last one to know it. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 29. She was 27. Her name was Brooke. We'd been together 6 years, lived together for 2 of them. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, and by the end of the night we'd talked for 4 hours and exchanged numbers, and I had driven home thinking about her the whole way. That's all the backstory you need. The first sign came 7 months before she left. I just didn't recognize it for what it was. She started staying up later. Not because of insomnia. Not because of work. Just on her phone. I'd wake up at 1, 2 in the morning, reach over, and the other side of the bed would be empty. I'd find her in the living room. Screen bright in the dark. When I asked what she was doing, she'd say Reddit. Or a podcast. Or just scrolling. And I believed her. Because why wouldn't I? The second sign came about a month after that. She started talking about this online community she'd joined. Some kind of creative writing forum, she said. People who were into the same books and genres she was passionate about. She seemed genuinely excited about it in a way I hadn't seen from her in a while. And I thought, honestly thought, that this was a good thing. She was finding something that gave her energy. I was supportive. I said it was great. I asked her about it. She told me a little. But even describing it, she kept things vague. Not suspicious vague. More like journal private. Like she was keeping it separate from our shared life for reasons that seemed harmless at the time. I didn't push. I should have asked more. I should have said, tell me everything. What do you talk about? Who are these people? But I didn't push. And that space I didn't push into. That's exactly where everything started. The third sign was the one I really should have caught. Brooke's best friend Kayla pulled me aside at a dinner party one evening. Kayla and I had always gotten along fine. She was the kind of person who said the thing nobody else would say, and she said it without cruelty, just with directness. I respected that about her. She looked at me that night and said, "Hey, is everything okay? With you and Brooke?" I said, "Yeah." "What?" She said, "Nothing. Just asking." But the way she said nothing wasn't nothing. It was the exact tone of voice someone uses when they have information they've decided it's not their place to share. I caught it. I registered it like you register a car alarm down the block. Present, briefly, and then gone from your attention. I went back to the party. I got a drink. I forgot about it. Because that's what I did. I noticed things. And then I told myself the things I noticed were smaller than they were. By month 5, something had genuinely shifted between us. Brooke was still there. Physically. Still in the apartment. Still at the dinner table. Still in the bed. But it was like having a conversation with someone who was slightly distracted. Like there was always a part of her processing something else. Half present. If I talked, she listened. If I asked questions, she answered. But she didn't reach for me the way she used to. She didn't initiate. Not conversations, not contact, not anything. The warmth was still there technically, but it was the warmth of a surface that used to hold heat. I brought it up once. Gently, carefully, because that was how I operated. I said, "Hey, I feel like we've been a little disconnected lately. Are you okay?" She said, "I'm fine. Just tired. Work stuff." I said okay. I said okay and left it there. Looking back at that moment now, that was probably it. The moment I should have pushed harder. The moment I should have said, "No, not work stuff. Talk to me. What's actually going on?" But I didn't say that. Because I was trying to respect her space. Because I didn't want to be the suffocating partner who demands emotional availability on command. Because I thought I was being emotionally intelligent. I was not being emotionally intelligent. I was being scared. Terrified, if I'm honest. Scared of what she might actually say if I made her say it out loud. So I left her the escape route. And she took it. Month 6. She came home from a weekend trip with Kayla, or so I believed it was with Kayla, and something was different. Not bad different. At least not obviously. She seemed lighter, warmer, more present than she had been in months. She hugged me at the door, really hugged me, the kind where you actually feel the other person. She said she'd missed me. She cooked dinner. Not just whatever, but actual dinner. The pasta dish she only made when she was in a genuinely good mood. We watched a movie together afterward. She laughed at the funny parts. She fell asleep against my shoulder. And I lay there in the dark with her head on my shoulder, and I thought, okay, whatever it was, it passed. We're back. I remember the relief. Stupid, blind, total relief. I should have felt the opposite. Because 2 weeks later, she sat me down. She had the look. The prepared look. The one that meant she had not only thought about what she was going to say, she had rehearsed it. She said, "I think we need to talk." I said, "Okay." She said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I said, "About us?" She said, "Yes." And then she said it. "There's someone I've been talking to. Not seeing. Not involved with. Talking to." Like that distinction was supposed to soften something. She told me his name. Cole. She told me they'd met in that online community about 6 months ago. She said it had started as just conversation. She said she wasn't entirely sure when it became more than that. She said, and this is the part that still lives somewhere in my chest when I let myself think about it. "He understands me in ways you never could." Said it like a fact, not a weapon. That's what made it cut the way it did. She wasn't trying to destroy me. She genuinely believed it. She got up. I saw the bag. And I said nothing. I found out 3 days later, from Kayla, who texted me because the guilt was eating her, that the weekend trip 2 weeks prior had not been with Qley at all. Brooke had gone to meet Cole. In person. For the first time. She had flown to his city. Spent a weekend. Come home. Cooked me dinner. Laughed at the movie. Fallen asleep on my shoulder. And said she'd missed me. I read Kayla's message standing in my kitchen. I put my phone face down on the counter. I stood there for a while. Then I picked it back up. Read it again. Put it down again. I didn't call Brooke. Didn't text her. Didn't call Kayla back. I just sat with it. Let it settle the way something heavy settles. My closest friend Will came over that night. He brought food. He said I sounded like I hadn't eaten when I'd called him. He was right. He set the containers down on the coffee table and sat across from me. He said, "Talk." So I talked. I told him everything in the order it had actually happened. The late nights on her phone. The online community. Qley. The 6 months of half-presence. The dinner she'd cooked the night she came back from his city. The bag by the door. The sentence. The weekend I hadn't known about until 3 days later. Will listened to every word without interrupting, which was actually unusual for him. When I finished, he said, "Did you have any idea?" Before the end. I said, "I had signs. I didn't know what I was looking at." He said, "That's different from not knowing." I said, "I know." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Nothing." He looked at me for a long moment. I said, "She made her choice. What is there to do?" He said, "You could fight for it." I said, "I don't want to fight for someone who's already somewhere else. What's the point of winning that fight?" He nodded slowly, not agreeing exactly, just absorbing. Then he said something I turned over in my head for weeks. He said, "Just don't disappear into it." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Some guys after something like this, they go under. Under the anger, or under the grief, or under the what-ifs. They just disappear inside it. Don't do that." I told him I wouldn't. I half meant it when I said it. The first month was the hardest. Not because I was desperate to win her back, but because 6 years of someone being woven into your daily life, and then silence. It's a particular kind of loud, that silence. Every room in the apartment had a ghost of her routine in it. The coffee mug she always used, the specific one, the blue one with the chip on the rim that she refused to throw away. The blanket she had claimed from the first week we moved in together and never relinquished. A book on the nightstand she'd been reading for months and never came back to collect. I left that book on the nightstand for 2 weeks. I told myself I hadn't gotten around to moving it. That wasn't why. I wasn't falling apart in any obvious way. I want to be honest about that. I was sad. Genuinely, deeply sad in the way that sits in your chest and makes everything slightly heavier. But I wasn't broken the way I'd expected to be. And that surprised me. I think, looking back now with the clarity you only get later, part of me had already known. Some quiet part of me had been watching the drift for months and recording it somewhere I didn't consciously access. I hadn't called it grief at the time, but that's what those months of half-presence and quiet distance had been. Preemptive grief. By the time she walked out, I had already been mourning the relationship for a long time. The day she left wasn't the tragedy. It was just the moment the curtain finally came down on something that had already ended quietly, in the background, while I was trying to convince myself everything was fine. 6 weeks after the breakup, a mutual acquaintance, not someone I was close to, just someone in the broader circle, sent me a message. Brooke and Qley were officially together. She had moved to his city, quit her job here, ended her lease, packed her actual life into boxes, and transplanted it to a place she had visited exactly once. For someone she had known in person for less than a month. I got that information on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my desk at work. I stared at my screen. Then I kept working. I thought about Qley, this person I had never seen, never spoken to. This man who had been living in my relationship for months before I even knew he existed, who had understood her in ways I never could. I wondered what that actually meant. I still wonder, if I'm being honest. Because understanding someone, really understanding them, is not something you accomplish in a forum. It isn't something that happens through messages and voice calls and the carefully chosen version of yourself that you present when you have the time and privacy to curate every single thing you say. But she believed it. And belief, I have come to understand, is often the thing that matters most in the beginning. Not the reality, the belief. I gave that more weight than I expected to, because I had to ask myself the uncomfortable question. Had I made her feel understood? Had I actually, genuinely, made her feel like I saw her completely? Or had I been so focused on maintaining the comfortable routine of the relationship that I had stopped looking at her as carefully as I used to? I didn't like my answer. About 2 months after the breakup, I started running. Not because I was having some televised motivational awakening, just because I needed to do something with my body that wasn't sitting still. Early morning, before work, 30 to 40 minutes through quiet streets while the city was still warming up. Just me and the sound of my own footsteps. My brain too occupied managing the physical effort to sit and spin in circles. It helped more than anything else I tried. I also started doing something I'd quietly stopped doing in the later months of the relationship. I started actually showing up in conversations. Not just with Will. With coworkers I'd kept at comfortable arm's length. Neighbors I'd only acknowledged with a nod. A woman at the Saturday coffee shop who turned out to be a documentary filmmaker with the most absorbing stories I'd ever heard from a stranger. I wasn't in replacement mode. Not looking for anyone. I was just open in a way I hadn't been in a long time. And that surprised me, because I'd thought of myself as a pretty open person when I was with Brooke. But when I looked honestly at who I'd been in those last couple of years, I'd actually been closed in a quiet way. Comfortable. Safe inside the perimeter of the life we'd built. Not reaching beyond it. Not inviting anything in that didn't fit the existing shape. "Well, notice the change in me," he said, about 4 months in. "You seem different." I asked him different how. He said, "I don't know exactly. Lighter, maybe." I didn't answer that, but I knew exactly what he meant. Here's something I never told anyone. Not Will. Not anyone. For months before Brooke left, I had planned a trip. Not the one already booked, something different. Something I'd built from scratch over 2 weekends. A small coastal town about 4 hours away. Neither of us had been there. I'd found a place to stay, not a hotel, a small rented house near the water with a deck that faced the ocean. I had a list of restaurants. A hiking trail that looked exactly like something Brooke would have loved. I had the whole thing ready to present. And then I sat on it. Week after week. I kept waiting for the right moment. A night when she was in a good mood, when things felt easy between us. I kept waiting for the opening. And when I finally tried to bring it up, she was distracted. I didn't push it. The moment slipped by. I told myself I'd try again next week. I never did. I never mentioned it again. Looking back, I've tried to understand why. And the honest answer, the one I don't particularly like, is that some wordless part of me had already sensed the drift. Some instinct I was refusing to name knew that she was already partly elsewhere. And planning a romantic trip for 2 people when one of them is already leaving. I think I couldn't quite make myself do it. Or maybe I was just bad at initiating the things that actually mattered. That's the other honest answer. I was exceptional at sustaining, at maintaining the shape of a relationship, at keeping the routine running smoothly. But I was not the guy who said, "Drop everything. Let's just go somewhere." Brooke was spontaneous by nature. She needed that energy around her. The energy of someone who reached for things, who moved toward life instead of maintaining it. And I, quietly, consistently, without any single dramatic failure, had stopped reaching. Not because I didn't care, because I was comfortable. And comfort and connection are not the same thing. That's what I didn't understand until it was too late to matter. Cole, whoever he was, whatever he was not comfort. He was new. He was someone who reached for her across hundreds of miles through a screen, who wrote long messages at midnight about the things she cared about, who made her feel like she was being seen by someone who could have been anywhere and chose to look at her. I understand the appeal of that. I've sat with it long enough to understand it honestly instead of just resenting it. But here is what I also understood, sitting alone in that apartment in the months after she left. What he saw was not the whole picture. He saw her best self, her curated self, the self she got to choose every single time she opened a message thread. He didn't see the version of her that got overwhelmed and went quiet, the version that sometimes needed to be reminded to call her mother back. The version that cried at completely unrelated things when she was stressed about something she didn't want to talk about directly. The version who burned toast almost every single time and refused to admit it was an issue. He hadn't seen any of that. He had fallen in love with a photograph. And I kept thinking, quietly, to myself, never out loud. Wait until reality shows up. Just wait. 5 months after the breakup, I met someone. Her name was Audrey. She worked in urban planning and had this very specific way of describing cities that made you see them differently than you ever had before. She talked about buildings like they had personalities, whole neighborhoods like they had emotional histories. She could make zoning policies sound interesting, which I had never believed was possible until she did it. We met at a dinner that was organized, not a setup. He swore it on everything, just a group thing. And we ended up at the far end of the table talking for almost 2 hours while the rest of the table slowly dissolved around us. I didn't feel fireworks. No thunderclap. Nothing cinematic. What I felt was comfortable in the best version of that word. The version where you don't have to perform. Where silences between 2 people aren't awkward, just quiet. Where you can say the slightly embarrassing honest thing and the other person doesn't flinch. They just respond with their own slightly embarrassing honest thing. We started seeing each other. Slowly at first. Coffee on a Saturday. Then dinner a week later. then a museum on a Sunday afternoon where she explained the architecture of the building itself more interestingly than anything actually on display inside. I was not trying to replace Brooke. I want to say that clearly because it matters. This was not the rebound version. It was just life. Life continuing the way it does when you let it, which is exactly what Will had told me to let happen. 7 months after the breakup, I had almost stopped thinking about Brooke. Not completely. You don't stop completely. After 6 years, the person lives in your muscle memory. You still reach for them occasionally in a thought. But she existed the way a scar exists. Present. No longer painful. Just there. I had stopped checking her name online, which I had done more than I'd like to admit in the first couple of months. I had stopped doing the mental math of where she was and what she was doing. I was genuinely, solidly okay. And then, one Thursday evening, Audrey was out with colleagues. I was on the couch, watching something, maybe half watching it. I picked up my phone to check a message Will had sent. And then I saw the other notification. Not a direct text. Not yet. It was a shared post. A screenshot being circulated by someone in our mutual circle. And then I saw it was being circulated by a lot of people. Because it had gone a little viral. A screenshot of a public post. From Qley. Qley had gotten engaged. To someone else. Not Brooke. To a woman he'd been apparently dating, quietly, privately, for the previous 4 months. Someone from his actual daily life. His city. Someone nobody in our extended circle had known about or even heard referenced. The announcement post had a photo. Qley and this woman, beaming, ring prominent in the frame. The comments were flooding with congratulations. But mixed in, and this is where the viral element lived, were other comments. Subtle ones. The kind that pointed at something without naming it. Phrases like, wow, that was fast, and didn't you just recently? That seemed to have already been partially deleted but were being screenshotted in other threads. Because it turned out Qley had also been in a semi-public relationship very recently. With someone who had met him online. Someone who had relocated for him. Someone who had apparently given up quite a bit to make that work. The comments didn't name Brooke directly, but anyone who knew the surrounding situation knew exactly what was being pointed at. I sat there with my phone. For a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that because it would be convenient to say I did. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel the satisfaction of being right about something. What I felt was more complicated and more uncomfortable than any of those things. I felt a hollow, specific ache. Because I knew what she must be sitting with right now. I knew what it felt like to have the person you had restructured your entire life around turn out to be something different from what you had believed. I knew the particular gutted feeling of the rug coming out from under the version of reality you'd committed to. I had felt something like that when Qley had texted me about the weekend. The dinner she'd cooked. The movie we'd watched. The way she had fallen asleep against my shoulder after coming home from his city and not telling me. That hollow, betrayed feeling. She was probably sitting with something like that right now. Times 10. Times the distance she'd moved. Times the job she'd quit. Times every conversation she'd had with me where she'd looked me in the eye and been somewhere else. I set my phone down. Looked at the ceiling. Thought about her. And then my phone buzzed. Not a notification. A direct message. Her name on my screen. Brooke. 7 months of silence. And then her name. I put the phone back down on the cushion beside me. Looked at the ceiling for a moment. Thought about whether I was ready for whatever this was. Then I picked it up and opened the message. Hey. Just that. I waited. 3 dots appeared. Then another message. I'm sure you've seen what's going around online. I waited. I'm really sorry for reaching out. I know I have no right to. I don't know who else to talk to right now. I sat with that for a full minute. I thought about not responding. Seriously considered it. Then I thought about who she was underneath all of it. Underneath the decisions and the exit and the sentence. The real version. I typed, I saw it. She responded quickly. I feel like such a complete idiot. I said, I'm sorry you're going through this. She said, I gave up everything. I literally quit my job. I moved. I packed up my whole life and I just believed him. I believed that what we had was real. I said, I know. She said, I kept thinking, the whole time, near the end with you, that something was missing, that I wasn't fully being seen. And then I found him and I thought, this is it. This is what it was supposed to feel like all along. I read that twice. I didn't respond right away. She said, and now I don't even know if any of it was real. I can't tell anymore what was real. I said, what are you going to do now? She said, I don't know. I'm already back, actually. I moved back last week. Before the announcement even went up. That surprised me. I said, what happened? Before the announcement. She took longer this time. Then she said, things had been off for a while between us. The online version of him, what I knew before I moved, it was different from the in-person version. Not in one obvious way, just different. Smaller differences that added up. We kept fighting about things that seemed small but weren't. I kept making excuses for it. And then last month he went cold. Just completely, suddenly cold. And I didn't understand why. And then last week he told me he needed space. So I came home. And then 2 days ago that post went up. I read all of that. Read it a second time. Then I said, I'm sorry, Brooke. She said, are you? No hostility in it. Genuine question. I said, yeah, I am. A pause. Then, can I ask you something? I said, sure. She said, did you know? Did you see something like this coming? With him. I thought about how to answer that honestly without being cruel about it. Then I said, I thought something like it was possible. She said, why didn't you say anything? I said, it wasn't my place. She said, right. Quiet for a moment. Then, are you okay? Like actually okay? That question almost got me. In a specific way. Because it was completely, entirely Brooke. Even in the middle of her own worst moment, asking if I was okay. That was the real her. Not the forum version. The actual one. The one who remembered your mother's birthday without being reminded. The one who left snacks on the counter when she knew you had a hard week ahead. That was the her that the photograph didn't show. I said, yeah, I'm actually doing really well. She said, good. I'm genuinely glad. And I believed her completely. Then 3 words appeared on my screen. I miss you. 3 words. I miss you. I had imagined, in the early weeks after she left, what it would feel like to hear those words. I thought they would feel like something being repaired. Like a lock finally turning the right way. But sitting there on the couch with the TV dim in the background and her name on my screen, those words didn't feel like repair. They felt like an open window in winter. Not inviting. Just cold. And a little bit sad. I typed, Brooke. She said, I know. I know. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. I said, I'm seeing someone. Silence. Longer than the others. Then, oh. Then. That's good. That's really good for you. I said, I'm not telling you to hurt you. She said, I know you're not. That's not how you operate. Then, is it serious? I thought about Audrey. The museum afternoon. The way she described a city block like it had a soul. The silences between us that had never once felt like gaps. I said, yeah, I think it is. She said, good. 1 word. Then, you deserve that. You always did. I said, so do you. When you're actually ready. She said, it might be a while before I'm ready. I said, that's okay too. Seriously. And then the conversation reached its end. Not a formal goodbye. Just the road ending at the edge of something. Both of us stopping. I put my phone down. Sat in the quiet of the apartment. The TV still running. Something I hadn't been watching. I turned it off. And I thought about that sentence. The one she delivered 7 months ago in the calm voice. He understands me in ways you never could. I thought about what she had just told me. How the online version of him had been different from the real one. How the understanding she had believed in had cracked when reality showed up and put pressure on it. How knowing someone in the clean conditions of a curated digital space is simply not the same as knowing them. Not even close. Not even in the same category. Will called the next morning. He'd seen the announcement circulating online. He said, she texted you, didn't she? Not a question. I said, how did you know that? He said, because of course she did. I told him about the conversation. All of it. He listened. Then he said, what did you actually feel when you were in it? I sat with that. Genuinely thought about it. I said, sad for her. Mostly sad for her. He said, nothing else. I said, a little bit of something when she said she missed me. But it wasn't the thing I thought it would be. He said, what was it? I said, more like grief than wanting. Like being sad for a version of things that doesn't exist anymore. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's healthy. I said, I think so. He said, you know what I kept thinking when I saw that announcement? I said, what? He said, I thought about you in that apartment the week after she left. The way you looked then. And then I thought about how you look now. And I thought, sometimes things work out exactly the way they're supposed to. Even when they're terrible while they're happening. I didn't say anything for a second. Then I said, that's almost profound for you. He said, don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my whole thing. I laughed. And that laugh, easy, unforced, felt like something important. Not closure exactly, but something adjacent. Something moving. Here's the other thing I never told anyone. About a month after Brooke left, I had written her a message. Not to send, just to write. It was long. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I wrote everything I hadn't said in the apartment that night. What the relationship had meant to me. What I thought had gone wrong, honestly, without assigning it all to her. What I wished I had done differently, and when and why. I wrote about the trip I had planned and never mentioned. I wrote about the moment I chose not to push when she said she was just tired. I wrote about the dinner she cooked when she came back from his city. I wrote about the way I had watched her go quiet and told myself it was just a phase instead of asking her directly what was happening. I wrote all of it. The ugly parts that reflected badly on me. The parts where I had been afraid to name the thing because I was afraid of the answer. The part where comfort had slowly replaced connection and I had let it because it was easier. Then I saved it in a draft folder, closed the app, and never opened it again. I didn't send it because sending it would have changed nothing. She was already gone. The decision was already made. But I wrote it because I needed to say those true things somewhere. Even to no one. Even to a document that would never be opened. And here is what I know now that I didn't know the night I wrote it. That draft, the act of writing it, was the thing that actually freed me. Not the running. Not Will's advice. Not time. The act of saying the complete and honest version to myself. Without softening it. Without making myself purely the wronged party and her purely the villain. Just what actually happened. What I did. What she did. What we both did. There is something in radical honesty with yourself that cuts the thread. I can't fully articulate why, but it does. The moment you stop performing the narrative in your own head. Stop casting yourself as the noble victim. Stop reducing the other person to a single terrible decision. The moment you actually look at the full picture without flinching. That's when you start to get free. Not happy necessarily. Not immediately. Just free. Able to move. It's been about 14 months since she walked out the door. Brooke and I have exchanged a handful of messages since that Thursday night. Nothing heavy. She's doing okay. Back in the city. Working again. She mentioned she started therapy. I told her that was good, and I meant it completely. We're not friends. There's too much layered history for casual friendship to work. But we're not hostile either. We're not carrying anything against each other. We're just two people who were very important to each other for a long time, and who now exist in parallel, separate lives that occasionally and briefly brush up against each other at the edges. That's probably the right distance. Audrey knows about the situation. I told her early because I think important things should be said early when they're relevant. She asked a few practical questions. Then she said, okay, not performing unbothered. Actually, genuinely okay with it. She's not threatened by the past. She's secure in a way that has nothing to do with me and everything to do with who she already is. That's one of the quiet things about her that I'm grateful for every single day. I took her to the coastal town. The one I had planned out in full for Brooke and never once brought up. I'd been holding that trip for almost 2 years. We drove up on a Saturday morning, windows down, coffee in the cup holder. We found the hiking trail on the third try because we took a wrong turn twice and ended up laughing about it. The view from the top was exactly as good as the photos had suggested. We stood at the edge of it for a while, not saying much, just looking, and it didn't feel like I was fixing something from before. It didn't feel like a do-over. It felt like starting something completely new, for the first time in the right direction. That's a different feeling. Better one. I did eventually look Qley up, not obsessively, not with any particular agenda, just enough to understand who this person actually was. He seemed like a perfectly ordinary guy. Reasonably charming online presence. Creative. Into books and ideas and the kinds of things Brooke cared about. I could see, clearly and without bitterness, why she had been drawn to him. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a calculated manipulator who had targeted her. He was just someone who was exceptionally good at being the person you want him to be in the limited, curated, controlled window of early-stage digital connection. And when the curation was forced to survive contact with reality, as it always eventually is, it couldn't hold its shape. That's not unique to him. That's just human. We all perform when we're trying to be seen the way we want to be seen. The difference is what happens when the performance runs out of energy. What's underneath when the curtain comes down? With Audrey, I had noticed early that she wasn't performing. On our second coffee, she told me, matter-of-factly, not dramatically, that she dealt with anxiety sometimes. She told me she'd been in a difficult relationship in her mid-20s that had taken longer to recover from than she had expected. She said she overthought most decisions. She said she was bad at mornings and that I should know that up front. She was just honest, not in an oversharing way. And this is actually who I am, take it as it is way. And I remember sitting across from her and thinking, that's it. That's what it's supposed to look like. Not the dazzling version that fades when real life shows up. The honest version that holds. I want to be careful here. I don't want to turn this into a lecture. But if someone asks me, and has asked me in different ways, more than once, what I actually took from all of it, here's what I'd say. Comfort is not the same as connection. You can be completely comfortable with someone and completely, quietly disconnected from them at the same time. And the slow drift of disconnection doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock on the door and say, hey, pay attention. You're losing something. It just happens. In the late nights on the phone you don't ask about. In the conversations that get a little shorter each time. In the mornings where neither of you is the one who starts talking. In the trip you planned and never brought up. You have to be willing to name the thing. Out loud. Even when naming it is deeply uncomfortable. Even when part of you is terrified of what the honest answer might be. Because the alternative, staying quiet, maintaining the comfortable shape, is how you get to the end and realize the drift had been going on for months. And you were the last one to know. The second thing, online connection is real. I believe that. But it is not the same as knowing someone. What Brooke felt for Qley was real. A real emotional experience built on an incomplete picture. And incomplete pictures are always the most flattering ones. Because they leave out everything difficult. Everything messy. Everything that requires actual patience and actual understanding rather than the performed version. What I had with Brooke was 6 full years of the complete picture. All the difficult parts included. The burned toast, and the stress shutting down, and the forgetting to call her mom back. The nights that were boring. The arguments about nothing. The whole, actual, unedited thing. That was worth something. Even though we didn't survive it. Even though we didn't find our way back. The third thing, and this is the one that caught me most off guard. Letting go without resistance is not the same as not caring. Some people who saw me in the weeks after Brooke left were surprised by how functional I appeared. One person actually said to me, casually, "You must not have been that invested if you're this calm." And I wanted to explain. I wanted to say, I cared enough not to make her stay somewhere she had already decided to leave. I cared enough not to turn my grief into her obligation. I cared enough to grieve privately and keep going and not call her at 2 in the morning because I needed her to manage my pain for me. That's not the absence of love. That is a specific and difficult kind of it. The kind that says, I want your life to be good even if your good life isn't happening with me. It's the hard kind. Most people don't recognize it because it doesn't look like anything dramatic. It just looks like a man sitting on a couch after the door closes, saying nothing, and then getting up in the morning and living anyway. 1 month after the Thursday conversation, Brooke, again, she said, "Hey, random thing. Do you remember that trip you once mentioned? A coastal place you were going to plan, but never did." I stopped. "Read it again." I said, "Yeah, I remember it." She said, "Did you ever go?" I said, "Yeah, recently, actually." She said, "Was it good?" I said, "It was really good." She said, "Good." Then, after a moment, "I always kind of wondered about that trip." I said, "Me too. For a long time." She said, "I hope it was worth the wait." I looked at my phone. I thought about the trail we took 3 wrong turns to find. The view that turned out to be exactly right. The 2 of us standing at the edge of it, not saying much. I typed, "Yeah, it was." Then I put my phone down, and I went back to the life that was actually mine. She said he understood her better than I ever could. Maybe he did. In the beginning. In the window. In the version of her that got to be chosen and curated and shown at its best. But real understanding isn't built in a forum. It isn't built through messages sent at midnight by someone performing their most magnetic self. It's built in the silence after the argument when both of you are too tired to be impressive. In the dinner made after the long, terrible week. In the moment where someone sees you at your actual worst, burned toast and all, and doesn't look anywhere else. She went looking for that, found a photograph of it, and when the photograph met reality, there was nothing underneath holding it up. Just the gap between who we perform and who we actually are. I stopped performing a long time ago. That's the whole story.